Our next speaker is a dear friend of all of ours. He is the executive director of the Francis Perkins Center. His name is Michael Cheney, and he has just lived through some terrible weather up in Damariscotta, Maine, where most of the people who know about this, the electricity and a lot of other stuff was out for 5 days? 7. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. As she said, I'm Michael Cheney. I'm Executive Director of the Francis Perkins Center, and we're so thrilled to be here for this second annual Perkins Roosevelt Symposium with the Women's City Club of New York and in partnership with Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute and the Francis Perkins Center in Newcastle. And thank you, Annette and Carol and Elizabeth and Harold for all your work in putting this together. I've got a couple words about my new friend Mary Murphy in a second. We had fun putting together this distinguished panel of people. You're going to hear some analysis from the first-person perspective of implementing government policy. But first, I just wanted to just say a couple of things. And to Ambassador Vanden Heuvel, those of us from Maine, we know. And we're sorry. But this last election, it was nice to see the second line in most of the national reporting about the citizen referendum that reinstated Medicaid in the state of Maine. And I won't tell you what the governor said in response, but we hope the citizens will speak and that policy will be implemented. I just wanted to say a couple things about the Francis Perkins Center. And again, Ambassador, thank you for your words about Francis Perkins and her role in American history. The center in Newcastle, Maine, was incorporated in 2009 to advance public's understanding of the Francis Perkins legacy. Her ability to effectively implement bipartisan legislation and her inspired dedication to improving conditions for all Americans led to advances in social justice and to the establishment of groundbreaking programs to help care for the aged, children, families, workers, and people with disabilities. And we're all lugging around this book, and one of our favorite quotes is from your fellow New Yorker, Adam Cohen, in referring to Francis's legacy. If American history textbooks accurately reflected the past, Francis Perkins would be recognized as one of the nation's greatest heroes, as iconic as Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Paine. Like Franklin, Perkins was a brilliant self-creation. There had not been anyone like her before, and there has not been anyone like her since. Like Paine, Perkins helped to start a revolution. One last little point about what the Perkins Center is about. We like to call attention to, through expert speakers and panelists, how Perkins' legacy and those New Deal programs endure today and what the opportunities and threats to those policies hold for the future. We recently had an overflow crowd at Bowdoin College where Jane Mayer spoke to her research on the Koch brothers and others about the role of dark money in our election system. And we can all gain access to the book. We can read her articles in the New Yorker, but so much of what she talks about is not in the public consciousness. It is not commonly discussed and understood in a way in which we can take action, as the ambassador suggested. And just one little final note, the Perkins Center is embarked on a capital campaign to acquire the Francis Perkins homestead in Newcastle, Maine. Her grandson is the last remaining heir. He owns the property, and he started the wheels in motion about a decade ago to create an organization and to build a board and to acquire the property and make it a center for public programs, research, and education. We're very encouraged in our progress, and we hope to come back in future Perkins Roosevelt symposiums to report progress. I do want to point out 3 of our board members are with us today from Maine. Chris Bryceth, our board chair. Chris, stand up. Sarah Peskin, our vice chair, and Susan Bateson, who with Sarah are co-chairs of the capital campaign effort. So we're happy to be here from Maine. And we'll be happy to report political progress in the future. So, my final task this morning is to introduce the panel that we have assembled before us. And again, I cannot thank Mary Murphy enough for reaching out to former colleagues and just working so collaboratively to put this program together. Furthest to my left is Ashley Putnam. She serves as the Economic Development Advisor for the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development. She facilitates the coordination between economic development and workforce development with a focus on creating opportunities for New Yorkers to access jobs that provide family-supporting wages. She's also served in the past as Fellowship Director at Work First Foundation and America Works of New York, where she managed literacy and training programs and oversaw research and evaluation. During her previous role, Ashley founded the Work First Fellowship, which connects young people interested in public policy with the opportunity to work directly on issues of urban poverty. She is a member of the Women's City Club of New York. Next is our friend Nancy Altman. I think I've got that right, yes. Nancy is a specialist, a 40-year background in the areas of Social Security and private pensions. She is president of Social Security Works and chair of Strengthen Social Security Coalition and Campaign. She is the author of The Battle for Social Security, From FDR's Vision to Bush's Gamble, and co-author of the book Social Security Works, Why Social Security Isn't Going Broke and How Expanding It Will Help Us All. She was on the faculty of Harvard University, Kennedy School of Government, and taught courses on private pensions and Social Security at the Harvard Law School. And in 1982, she was Alan Greenspan's assistant in his position as chairman of the bipartisan commission that developed the 1983 Social Security amendments. So there's a long history there with the program. Next to her is Debbie Berkowitz, senior fellow at NELP, the National Employment Law Project, and has a long record of achievements in the field of occupational safety and health. Most recently, Debbie served as senior policy advisor for OSHA, after previously serving as OSHA's chief of staff from 2009 to 2013. Before joining the public sector, Debbie spent over 2 decades building and leading worker safety and health programs inside the labor movement with partner groups. Her previous positions include Health and Safety Director of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union and the Health and Safety Director of the Food and Allied Services Trade Department of the AFL-CIO. And then we have Tricia Smith, former Obama administration Solicitor of Labor. Trish joined NELP as senior counsel, where she will play a central role in developing and implementing the organization's litigation work and other advocacy strategies that advance and defend workers' rights. As Solicitor of Labor from 2010 to 2017, Tricia served as the chief legal advisor to 2 secretaries of labor and directed a staff of over 650 lawyers across the country. During her tenure, she transformed the solicitor's office into one that aggressively litigated around worker protections and which worked closely with the Labor Department's enforcement agencies to creatively advance workers' interests through both enforcement and policy. Similar to Frances Perkins' path, prior to her tenure at the Department of Labor, Tricia served as the New York State Commissioner of Labor, where she led enforcement of labor laws throughout the state. Excuse me. And finally, the moderator of the panel is Mary Murphy, a member of the board of the Women's City Club of New York. From 1985 until 2005, Dr. Murphy served as Regional Administrator of the U.S. Department of Labor Region 2 Women's Bureau. Following her retirement from government, Dr. Murphy became a senior advisor to the Education and Employment Research Center at Rutgers University in New Jersey. She holds a PhD in sociology from Columbia University and will guide us through our discussion this morning. Thank you all for being here. Just a logistical note, you saw cards and pens on your chairs. What will happen as we get into the program, you'll see some staff assemble on either side. If you want to participate with a comment or a question, write it on the card and get it to one of the people on the side, and Mary will handle it from there. Okay, Mary, welcome.
Well, I'm with you. I'm going to stand up here because I can see better and then sit down and we will hear our speakers. I want to thank Michael Chaney and Elizabeth Lubetkin-Lipton and Padma Simangal. This was the team that said, we've got to do this. And we have to do it now, and we've got to do it right. And I hope you will join us in feeling that we're getting it right. Ambassador Vanden Heuvel, you nailed it. There's no question about it, and I would like those remarks written out. Thanks also to Harold Holzer, our host, and the Roosevelt colleagues. I spent the weekend on the book. It was a bestseller in 1946, and it should be a bestseller again, because when you read it, and when you think then and now, you get a little shiver. Now, the greatest shiver of all would be to have Frances Perkins sitting out there afterwards and signing it for us. I kind of dreamt about that for a minute. That can't happen, but I do want to give our wonderful new executive director her copy and would ask that Frances Perkins and the Roosevelt light shine down on you, both as her being a founding member and Eleanor Roosevelt being a member. The policies and programs which, frankly, and the ambassador did such a great job with Harold in sort of summarizing for you all, I am simply going to rename. They're right up there in terms of workers' rights with the 4 freedoms. Minimum wage and protection from wage theft. Employers do steal wages, then and now. Job safety and worker health. A ceiling on hours worked. We're going to be hearing about the gig economy. Workers' compensation. If you hurt yourself, there is someone to give you financial relief. Unemployment insurance. If the country goes to hell in a handbasket, maybe with merely the recession of 2008 or another depression. Unemployment insurance, or you lose your job or it goes offshore, which the current president of the White House seems to talk about a lot, but that's about it. The unemployment insurance is there for you. Certainly, Social Security, and we didn't mention it, but there were kids, little kids, working back in the 1930s. And if they're working today, the Labor Department and the state labor departments will get them. I've seen a little bit of it in New York, but not much. It seems to be a child care issue. Having said that, we're here today at this part of the program because there's a very good chance, if we're not vigilant as advocates and even as workers, that despite this incredible progress, that many of these very basic policies and protections could be threatened. This threat, in my mind at least, is born of many things. Times change. The workplace changes. Technology moves ahead at a logarithmic pace. There is this gig economy with the proliferation of unprotected, precarious workforce made up of independent contractors, part-timers, temps, and leased workers. It nips at our heels. And administrations change. Lawmakers change. Regulations get dropped or rewritten. Big money too often controls campaigns and advocates. And believe me, this entire program that we have heard about could not have been done without the help of labor unions, and they are losing strength. To lead this today, to lead us through this today, because we want to talk about today, people still depend upon a job to earn a living, to have a living. They don't have trust funds. Most Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and worker protections and worker rights are essential in a decent, fair, and free America. Those were apparently 3 words that FDR used a lot: decent, fair, and free. So, I would like to tell you about our amazing speakers who have been introduced to you. But I can assure you that each one has in one way or another devoted their career and work life to protecting and refining, as well as implementing, the Roosevelt Perkins policies. They are experts all, and I can safely say to all of us lucky people in this room, pretty much the last word on what's going on in the U.S. today in terms of worker rights. They have been doing other things. There has been progress since the 1930s. Eradicating discrimination on the job, or trying to. Sexual harassment, eradicating sexual harassment or violence in the workplace. Trafficking in women and girls. They've been trying to strengthen parental leave, affirmative action in federal contracts, employment and training programs for low-income, out-of-work America. There's lots that's been happening. These 4 people have all, each in their own way, made huge contributions. So without further ado, and Frances Perkins did not like small talk, I am going to turn it over to our distinguished speakers. Please take it away, and we will begin with Tricia Smith.
So I'm going to sit, because when I stand, you don't see any more of me, really. So, and it's more comfortable to sit. So the topic today is the Perkins-Roosevelt legacy, peril or progress. And I'm just going to start out by saying this is not going to be an uplifting discussion that I'm going to have with you, because there's far more peril than there is the possibility of progress. And I fear that because of all the other things that are happening in the administration, that so much of what this administration is doing isn't really understood among the general public. So I'm going to talk to you only about labor issues and what's happening to in the labor field by this administration. I want to start back by talking a little bit about Frances Perkins, though. Frances Perkins was a big believer in the administrative state. She was a big believer that government should have a safety net. That sometimes had her in conflict somewhat with labor unions, because labor unions then, and including today, sometimes believe that too much of a government safety net is sort of not takes away the incentive for collective bargaining. And I've seen that in my own life, with sometimes labor unions are a little bit lukewarm about a government-administered safety net. But she was a big believer in it, and she obviously was very successful in it. And obviously Debbie is going to talk about health and safety, and we're going to talk about Social Security. I'm going to talk about other things. Today, we are witnessing the dismantling of the administrative state. That's what the administration said it wanted to do. And although many people feel like because what you're reading in the paper, they're not getting things through Congress, that this is a very unsuccessful administration, let me tell you that when it comes to dismantling the progress of the last number of years, they are going full steam ahead. So let me give you some examples. In 2016, the last administration promulgated a rule that would increase the overtime protections for 4.2 million Americans. That rule is being pulled back. They promulgated a rule in 2016 that embodied the revolutionary theory that if you go to a financial advisor and that financial advisor is advising you about your retirement, they have to put your best interest first and not their best interest first, which is exactly what was happening. And so there were undisclosed fees. Sometimes your financial advisor would be getting compensation for steering you to some products and not other products when actually they weren't in your best interest. That regulation is in the process of being dismantled. Now, when I talk about being in the process of being dismantled, I have to give a certain amount of credit to the Labor Department as opposed to other departments like EPA and HHS. They're actually following the procedural requirements that it takes to pull back regulations, as opposed to other departments that were not, have been sued, basically mostly successfully being sued for violating the administrative procedures. The Labor Department, so they're in the process. It hasn't happened yet, but they've put out, for instance, in overtime, they've basically said to the courts, don't bother reviewing this regulation because we're reviewing it. They've put out a request for information saying, tell us how we can, we think this number is too high. Let's figure out how to lower it. In the conflict of interest, they are about to put out a regulation that will delay all of the enforcement mechanisms of the regulation for 18 months so they can figure out how to dilute that regulation or maybe even take it back. Another thing that the Obama administration did, and this was basically to attempt to buck up somewhat unions. One of the problems, and union density in the private sector today is around 7%. One of the problems is that employers have become expert on anti-union campaigns. So there are actually firms out there that specialize in defeating unions. Employers hire those firms, they go into the campaign, even though they have good support at the beginning of the campaign. By the time the election comes around 5, 6, 7 months later, workers are frightened. The Obama administration put out a regulation that said, when you hire one of these anti-union, you have to disclose it. And the reason is the workers have a right to know that what their supervisors are telling them is not necessarily what the supervisors believe, but what their employer and the anti-union firm has scripted exactly what to say. That is a regulation that they've taken back. There was another regulation that they put out. We have a retirement crisis in this country. There are so few people that really have good retirement. And one of the things that's been happening is the states have been stepping up, saying, and trying to sort of experiment in retirement programs that the state would mandate and sort of basically be the administrative structure so that small employers would be easier for them to have retirement programs. That regulation was taken away. There was a regulation that would require federal contractors. The federal government is the largest employer in this country. It employs, through its federal contractors, approximately 25% of companies in America. There was a provision that would have required contractors to disclose if they had a history of labor law violations, so that the contracting agencies who have to make a determination, they're only supposed to contract with responsible contractors, but they wouldn't know this information. And so the point was to let contracting officers understand if there were certain contractors that had a history and make sure that they had remedied those violations. That was taken back. There was a regulation that would have required pay transparency. This is very important to women especially, who we know are still only making about 70 cents of every dollar that a man makes. That would require employers, as part of their EEOC, the part of their equal opportunity requirements, to disclose what they paid to men and to women. That's been taken back by this administration. There was a regulation in the last administration that made clear what the Labor Department's position had always been, that if you're a tipped employee, those tips belong to you. They don't belong to the employer. And yet the government has indicated, because there's been litigation about that they are taking back that regulation. That regulation, we don't know exactly what's in it yet, but they've publicly said to the Supreme Court, we're taking back that regulation. What does that mean? That means that employers can, as long as they pay the minimum wage, they can do with those tips anything they want. They can distribute them to the back of the house, and they can pocket them if they so please. So that is the peril that we're seeing. It's deliberate, and it's happening. Is there progress? Well, this is kind of interesting, because one of the things that Frances Perkins believed in was that we needed federal programs, that we didn't want to, at least it wasn't her first choice, to rely upon the states, because one of the things that she'd seen when she was in New York, that as New York passed progressive labor legislation, you'd have companies that didn't want to do it, and they'd move to Pennsylvania, or they'd move to Connecticut, or they'd move to some other state that didn't have it. So she was a big believer in federal programs. Well, now the progress, if we're going to have progress, we're going to have to turn to the states. And there is progress happening in the states, and there's progress happening in many states. So for instance, the Fight for 15, which is, a fight to raise the minimum wage to 15, is happening in the states, and it's happening in cities. So we are seeing progress in the states, and that's one of the places that I think that we're going to have to really focus our energies on in the next at least 3 years, and hopefully not the next 4 more after that. But the states are really, are really being progressive. So that's sort of the overall, that's what's happening. Now I want to go back to some of the things that were very important to Frances Perkins when she was the Secretary of Labor and talk about those. One of the things that obviously was important to her was a minimum wage, and obviously during that administration they passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. It's really interesting to me that she herself believed that the minimum wage should be a living wage, that she had said many times that it should be a wage that would support a family, give them some money to enjoy life and not just be, now that's not what the minimum wage is. It's not what the minimum wage was when it was passed. But again, we're seeing some progress in the states. Frances Perkins believed in the public employment. That was, and when she first became Secretary of Labor, she went to the president and she said, we have to totally revamp it. The public employment system is important. This administration, the biggest cut in the Labor Department is going to be to the public employment system, a 30% budget cut. She believed in labor statistics. She really believed in the Bureau of Labor Statistics and wanted it to have good science, to have good statistics. That's a big cut. And of course, we know that this administration is a big believer in dubious science. Unemployment insurance, another very important program to her, is really in a mess across the country. In some states, in Florida, the uptake rate, that means the number of people who after they applied actually get it, is 12%. 12% of the people applying for unemployment insurance, for 2 reasons. First of all, the states are making the requirements tighter. And secondly, there are many, many barriers, and I'm talking technological barriers. You can't call up anymore and call the unemployment insurance office and apply. What you've got to do is apply online. So people who don't have access to computers, people who are not necessarily computer literate, are having a very, very difficult time getting unemployment insurance. Immigration. I don't know if you know, but when Frances Perkins took over the Labor Department, the largest department was the Bureau of Immigration. In that point, immigration was in the Labor Department. It was 2/3 of the Labor Department's budget. And she was very concerned with immigration. I don't know if you know that Frances Perkins was impeached, that there were articles of impeachment drawn up against her, and it was because she refused to deport Harry Bridges, who was a union leader on the West Coast, a very successful Australian by birth union leader. I want to say one thing about that, which is that during her impeachment proceedings in the House, you know who came down and actually turned the tide? The Congress from New York, who are closely associated with Tammany Hall. And there's a book out there about rethinking the whole concept of Tammany Hall, that Tammany Hall was actually the inventors of the concept of the social safety net. And I can't remember the name of that book, but I highly recommend it. It's a really new way of thinking about Tammany Hall. Refugees. And of course, today we know that and we've heard about this, we are not welcoming to refugees, that this administration is cutting the number of refugees. We have the travel ban. Frances Perkins recognized that we had a moral obligation to refugees. And again, it was a time when refugees were not welcome, and she did everything in her power to prioritize political and religious refugees. She was the one that originally allowed families to bring their family members in as a priority, which we know is now under attack. So the immigration issues were very important to her, and so many of those areas that she worked on are being pulled back by this administration. I want to say two things finally. We heard about the immigration problems today. We heard about the Disney situation. I am the person who determined that situation, unfortunately, was legal. We need immigration reform in this country, and we need it desperately. And I also think that we need to think about what those reforms are, because we have a divide in this country. This is not a divide between right and left or working class or whatever. It's really, in my opinion, a divide between big corporations and workers. Because big corporations, whether they support Democrats or Republicans, we're talking big corporations here, they want to bring in workers. And because, frankly, under these programs, those workers will work for less. And that's a big problem. So I think we need immigration reform, but I also think that we need to look at the proposals that are going to be coming in, because they are not necessarily the proposals that are going to help American workers. One last story, it's because we had to hear about Maine. I always say one of the most fun things that I did as Solicitor of Labor was I got to write a letter to the governor of Maine, the same governor we have there. I don't know if you remember this, but a few years ago, he took down in the Maine Labor Department the mural, right? The working mural, and he took it down. And I, because I understood the funding, realized that the Federal Labor Department had paid for that mural. So if he took it down, he had to pay us back. So I got to write the letter that said, if you don't put that mural back up, you owe us about $350,000. Yes. It's now in the Maine State Library. I didn't get them. What I really wanted them to do was to put a little kiosk there so you could apply for unemployment insurance while you looked at it. I didn't get that. But anyway, so yes, we are at a time of great peril, and I think that one of the things that we have to do is go beyond the headlines and actually pay attention to what's happening.
Thank you.
This is hard to follow, Tricia. So first of all, it's an honor. Thank you, Mary, to be here today. It's an honor to be in this building. It was an honor for me to serve 6 years as part of the Obama administration in the Frances Perkins building. but probably my greatest honor was being Tricia Smith's colleague. And I'm still her colleague now. I mean, really, how lucky am I? And I really, truly, and she's very self-effacing, but you can't get closer to Frances Perkins' legacy than Tricia Smith and working for Tricia Smith. So let me just, I promised Mary I would say what the National Employment Law Project is, because Tricia is now senior counsel there, which is great. We are part of a huge effort to fight back. So every single thing Tricia mentioned, we work round the clock fighting back, filing lawsuits, doing advocacy, getting congressional sign-ons with 100 different organizations and allies, educating the public about this. NELP is a small nonprofit law and advocacy organization. We provide research, advocacy, and public education to advance the employment and labor rights of this nation's workers, especially low-wage workers. So I'm really so happy that you are talking about worker health and safety, because I think when we look at labor rights, we sort of don't really talk about that too much because we don't think about it as pocketbook issues, which are really pressing. But really, a worker injury and worker safety and health are huge pocketbook issues. The nation spends over $181 billion a year just on workplace injuries. And also, especially for low-wage workers, an injury to a worker puts them at great risk to falling into poverty. So the great thing about Frances Perkins is that she, I believe, was one of the first health and safety policy professionals. I mean, I think she started the field that I have been in since I was 23 years old. From her work with the National Consumers League, from her work in college, she went into industrial settings and she saw people getting hurt. She saw them getting killed, and she realized that didn't have to be, that you could prevent it. In the 1900s, you could prevent it. And as Tricia said, what she realized is government clearly had a role because companies weren't going to do that on their own. They, sort of made a calculation that it was cheaper to kill and injure workers than it was to prevent an injury, which isn't really true in the end. Safety pays. A $10,000 harness that a roofer has to put on a worker saves a $70,000 injury when they break their leg. And, I think she was really thrust into this field in 1911 with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. She was, having tea or something down in Greenwich Village when in 18 minutes, 146 workers were killed. With a fire, when many of them jumped to their lives, the doors were blocked because they didn't want workers to steal things. And so, Frances Perkins was made the secretary of the Committee on Safety, which had never existed before. And of course, she fought for, I think there were 36 labor laws in New York that she introduced following that committee. They included safety laws, little things like you have to empty your trash can every day, which is still the law of the land in New York, and fire prevention. But also, she started really becoming an advocate for something called workers' compensation that many of you probably only read about in the paper by the one or two people that might abuse the system as opposed to most of the workers that really need it and don't get adequate benefits. But so let me just tell you, in March of 1911, there were no workers' comp statutes in any state of this union. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was in April of 1911. And right before that, New York had passed a law, then it was challenged. And the day before the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the New York Court of Appeals, which was the highest court in New York, ruled that the law was unconstitutional. So all these workers that were injured and killed, there were no death benefits for the family. There was nothing for injury. And of course, and I don't remember the wonderful book about it, but there was no money. The owners had socked away all their money, and they couldn't even sue the owners of the factory. So they were all out. So it wasn't long between Frances Perkins and Teddy Roosevelt passed the New York State workers' comp laws, which was really one of the first workers' comp laws in the country. And I'm going to talk about what happened to them, these laws since then. You know, when I was preparing for this speech, I found this quote from Frances Perkins that said, when she came to Washington, she said, "I came to Washington to work for God, FDR, and the millions of forgotten, plain, common working men." She really did do that, as opposed to Trump, who's totally, you know, it's just propaganda and using it to sort of exploit what he's doing, the common working man, but he used the same exact words that she used. So when I got to OSHA in 2009, and this is a little bit of Frances Perkins and the legacy, and then I'll talk about the perils. One of the first things that we knew we had to do was to update a regulation to protect workers from a deadly disease called silicosis. Now, silicosis comes from silica, which is used in making your fancy granite countertops in your kitchen. Silica is in granite. It comes from, and when you cut it, it produces very fine dust, which causes this deadly lung disease called silicosis, which is disabling and often fatal. It's also when you're cleaning your bricks on your houses or on the walkways, when you're sandblasting it, it causes workers to be exposed to silica dust. It's when they drill into cement. And workers were still dying of silicosis. And, so we were updating a 40-year-old standard. This effort had already gone on for 15 years by the time I got to OSHA. That's how long it takes the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to write a standard. And I was working, our secretary of the assistant secretary for OSHA, David Michaels, said to me, "Go back and do some research on frankincense and silica, and let's get that on the website, and let's use this as part of our messaging." So I went back, and sure enough, after she became Secretary of Labor, there was another industrial disaster. Remember, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire got her really into worker safety. In the 1930s, they were building in West Virginia, the town is called Gawley Bridge, but they were building the Hawks Nest Tunnel, and they were tunneling through huge granite rock in West Virginia. And 100 workers died, right, as they were working, of silicosis. 1,500 more got silicosis within the 2 years after they had left from drilling into that rock. So she formed a commission right away. And then she had a conference, the National Silicosis Conference in the 1930s. And she launched a campaign to stop silicosis, a campaign we relaunched in 2012. And she said, she figured out right away this could be prevented. They could have used wet saws when they were tunneling through to reduce the dust. They could have given workers respirators, but they didn't. And she decided we needed a big public education campaign. And it was like totally brilliant. I watched the video, I think, is still on the Department of Labor website because, they haven't discovered everything yet. So, but one of the things she showed was that if you take a sieve and you pour water in it, this sieve, which was very fine, actually held the water. But if you put silica dust in it, you could see the silica dust sprinkle out of the sieve. She wanted to show that it was such fine particles of the silica dust that were killing people that we really had to do something about it, that this was an insidious hazard. And she really believed if you showed companies the right thing to do, they would do it. Of course, that isn't quite what happened. So when I got to OSHA, and thanks to the wonderful work of Tricia Smith, we did pass a new standard to protect workers from silicosis. It's going to save 600 lives a year, and 900 more cases of workers getting sick will be prevented. But this is a new day. I was at OSHA for 7 years, and I would say the real difference now is not only is this new administration trying to just not move forward, they are trying to dismantle and dismantle 40 years. And so let me just tell you, so with silica, of course, the industry has gone into, challenge the rule, we can't have this. And one of the main lawyers attacking the rule, who is a Trump nominee to lead a division of the Environmental Protection Agency, said that silica dust is dust, like the dust in your home. It's not hazardous. We all know about dust. Seriously, that's a quote he said in front of the appeals court. Also, they're saying there is no silicosis. Forget facts, forget this. So it's all, very scary. OSHA was created in 1970, the agency I work for. Then there were 14,000 workers a year that got killed on the job. Today, with twice the number of workers, there's still 4,800 workers, which is high, but OSHA's really had a tremendous effect. So when they start dismantling OSHA, more workers are going to get killed on the job. Just briefly, just in the last year, really since January, all I've been doing is fighting back. Never before in the agency's history have they ever looked at a regulation that governs something that causes cancer and decided to weaken it and roll it back and expose more workers to this carcinogen. They did that. They proposed a rule that would expose workers in shipbuilding and construction to more of a carcinogen and offer them less protection. No new data, no new studies. They just are, facts don't really make a difference. Industry asked, and so they're doing this. Congress, and I think prompted by the administration, was trying to put a rider on this new silica standard so that they couldn't enforce it. But luckily, it's like just sometimes luck comes your way. The Republicans screwed up and they didn't get their amendment in time. So there's no rider this year. OSHA has also stopped issuing press releases, which is, I know it doesn't seem to you like a big deal, but OSHA, it would take 150 years for OSHA to enter every workplace just once. OSHA's a big political football here. You hear big bad OSHA, they're terrible. They are like this teeny weeny agency that does a lot, but not that much. But if you don't put out press releases when OSHA does any enforcement, employers are going to forget about it. And they're going to forget about safety because it's easier to cut corners on safety than it is to, give a respirator or put a guard on a machine. And you're going to see a whole lot more of workers getting hurt and workers getting killed. We have other agencies jumping into the bandwagon. I do a lot of work on meat and poultry workers who are low-wage workers, who are really exploited workers in an industry. And the United States Department of Agriculture has a big role in their life. And the industry has decided that they want to increase line speeds in the industry, meaning they want to be able to process as many chickens as fast as they want. And right now there's some food safety regs that make it sure that they can't really do that. But the industry petitioned the U.S. Department of Agriculture to just ignore regulations and just allow them to increase line speeds, which we think they're going to do. Of course, NELP will sue them. But I just want you to know that there's really a sense of we don't have to be constrained by the rule of law. And, meatpacking and poultry workers, largely immigrants, largely minority, very terrified of being fired and really exploited. And then I just want to talk a little bit about workers' comp and the role of this wonderful organization and something you may think about doing, and that is workers' comp started in 1911 in every single state, but the great state of Texas does require that most employers carry workers' comp. But really, over the last 30 years, workers' comp has been a race to the bottom. Employers have complained about high premium costs and insurance costs. It was a grand bargain where workers gave up the right to sue if they got hurt on the job. And but in exchange, they would get medical benefits and some lost pay to help them get back to work. But over the last, I would say, 30 years now, the system is being dismantled. And just recently in New York State, the Workers' Comp Board proposed changes to the workers' comp system that would drastically cut what workers would get when they would get hurt. It drastically cut benefits. And there's really no basis for this. Workers' comp premiums in New York have been going down. The cost per 100 workers of covered wages have been going down. The premiums are drastically lower than they were 20 years ago. It's that industry, it's what I call like a wolf. They smell blood, and they feel like that they can go do this, and this is something that the City Club could certainly help support. But all over the nation, workers' comp is really a race to the bottom, and now I would say that the majority of the cost of a work-related injury is borne by workers, which is why if they get hurt in the job, they're often knocked right out of the middle class and into poverty. So thank you.
Thank you. The organizations partnering this symposium today have a history that is really intertwined with Social Security. We all know with the Women's City Club that both Eleanor Roosevelt and Frances Perkins were founding members, very active in the organization. A third woman, Molly Dewson, who was not even well known in her time, was also instrumental with Social Security. In fact, when Social Security was first enacted, it was, before there was a single commissioner, the initial legislation called for a 3-member board. Mary Dewson was nominated by Franklin Roosevelt to be on that 3-member board, and the Senate confirmed her. So there's a dramatic intertwining of that history. Obviously, the Frances Perkins Center. Frances Perkins was the driving force in the enactment of Social Security. In fact, as was mentioned earlier, Harold Holzer mentioned that just upstairs in this building, the Franklin Roosevelt and Frances Perkins met, and one of her, in their conversation about naming her, one of her demands was that he be fully behind Social Security, which of course he was. And she knew he would be because they had worked very closely in New York in enacting old age pensions. Their focus at that point, it was a means-tested program, was to get rid of poorhouses. New York, and in fact, every state but New Mexico had poorhouses before the enactment of Social Security. But they wanted to do much more than that. They were quite ambitious. In fact, a number of people have mentioned The Roosevelt I Knew, Frances Perkins' memoir, written in 1946. In it, she said, President Roosevelt, quote, has always regarded the Social Security Act as the cornerstone of his administration, and I think took greater satisfaction from it than from anything else he achieved on the domestic front. And I think that really spoke about her as well as him. She was named in 1934, so Social Security was enacted in 1935. Before that, the president put together an interagency task force to develop the legislation, and he named Madam Perkins as the chair of that group. And again, as I say, she was the driving force. It's important to understand that today we think of Social Security as the old age survivors disability insurance, the wage replacement program that people receive. But at that time, the concept of Social Security or economic security was much broader. In fact, Molly Dewson gave a speech, I think actually here in New York for the Women's City Club, called Social Security, What Is It? You can find it online. And she talked about a wholesome education. She talked about having universal health. She talked about a guaranteed job. She talked about, and of course, old age protection, disability insurance protection. They had quite a vision of basic economic security that we all should have. And in fact, the Committee on Economic Security had all of these. They had a working group on old age security. They also had a working group on employment opportunities, another working group on maternal health, and so forth. They had quite the broad vision. They understood, though, that, and they thought health insurance, universal health insurance, was almost in the Social Security Act. It was dropped. President Roosevelt got lobbied very hard about it, and he dropped it at the last moment, thinking that it could jeopardize the whole bill. It was that it was too big a bite to start with. But they all thought it was just around the corner. In fact, Frances Perkins in February of 1935, so the legislation was introduced in January of 1935. And she said, the bill, speaking of the legislation that had just gotten introduced, is, I believe, a sound beginning on which we can build by degrees to our ultimate goal. We cannot hope to accomplish all in one bold stroke. To begin too ambitiously in the program of Social Security might very well result in errors which would entirely discredit this very necessary type of legislation. And indeed, when President Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law in August 14th of 1935, he talked about it as a cornerstone, a foundation by no means complete on which to build. Sure enough, in 1939, old age insurance was enacted in 1935. In 1939, they added survivor's insurance and spousal benefits. In 1956, they added and then the war came. They really wanted to make progress. There are statements of President Roosevelt where he really was going to push for universal health insurance. But of course, the war intervened. We then had Republican control of Congress. But in 1956, disability insurance was enacted. At the 25th anniversary of Social Security in 1960, Frances Perkins said, I think that as we stand here and as we sit here and think about the precious child, we want to see it grow. It has grown enormously, the metaphor, of course, to Social Security. It has grown enormously in these years. It has improved, its administration has grown bigger and bigger as the imagination of those in charge have pointed out what could be done. But there is yet much that needs to be done. And they saw that they were going to keep building on this. So in 1965, Medicare was enacted. Now that was actually a fallback position. They had been trying to get universal health insurance in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s unsuccessfully. So they decided to do it incrementally. They started with the most expensive part of the population, seniors, but there was also the greatest need. So that was the first step towards Medicare for all. In 1972, another step was taken. People with disabilities were included under Medicare. But that's where progress stopped. We then had a real, there was a real sea change. Social Security has always been enormously popular with the American people. And there used to be, in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, people said, oh, it's socialism, government shouldn't do it, the federal government shouldn't be doing it. These are, we're a free country, those are positions people are of course free to take. They always lost. The American people understood how important Social Security is. So in the late 1970s, the tactics began to change. You stopped hearing that Social Security is a bad program. Everybody loves Social Security, but we can't afford it. It's going bankrupt. Sorry, needs to be modernized, all of that. And we had the President Reagan who came in and said, government's not the solution, government's the problem. And then we had New Dems who looked for marketplace solutions and really turned their back on this legacy of Franklin Roosevelt and Frances Perkins, where they saw government could be a force of good in all of our lives. Now, if we had had this symposium maybe 5 years ago, I would be ending on this. I would be talking about, Bush's effort to privatize Social Security and so forth, and say, this is really in peril. But I actually come after these other talks with good news. And I think we are on the cusp of making progress. Now, the fight isn't over, obviously. The fight will never be over. There's a lot of money on the other side trying to convince us that Social Security is going bankrupt. And as I like to say, we are the wealthiest country in the world at the wealthiest moment in our history. Of course we can afford to expand Social Security, expand Medicare. This is not a question about affordability, it's a question about values. Now, the other side never wants to have the argument on terms of values because they know they will lose. But that is really what the fight is about. The Democratic Party lost its way for several decades, but I am happy to say that in this last presidential election, Bernie Sanders ran on expanding Medicare and, expanding Social Security and Medicare for all. Secretary Clinton ran on, although you didn't hear much about it just because of all the noise of the election, but she ran on expanding Social Security. The Democratic platform had a very strong plank calling for expand Social Security. So if the Democrats choose to run strongly on this, they will win. The American people are with the position of expand Social Security. One of my favorite polls that was taken during the just ended presidential campaign was by the Pew Foundation in March of 2016. And at that point, you had Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side it was still during the primaries. And you had Donald Trump, John Kasich, and Ted Cruz on the Republican side. And they asked people, who do you support among these 5 candidates? And then what do you think about immigration? What do you think about minimum wage? What do you think about all these environmental protection? And then they included, what do you think about Social Security? The only issue where Ted Cruz voters and Bernie Sanders voters agreed was on Social Security. So that is a winning issue. The concept, and it is time to build, to pick up the mantle and build further. Social Security does not need to be modernized. It is thoroughly modern. The concept of Social Security is that if you are dependent on wages, which virtually everyone is, that you need insurance against the loss of those wages. You can become unemployed, you need unemployment insurance. You can become disabled and lose wages for that reason. You can die leaving young children and your wages need to be replaced to protect your dependents. And if you're fortunate to grow to old age and you retire, you need a joint and survivor annuity, which Social Security provides. You need not savings, but insurance that you cannot outlive. But you also need, and Social Security now includes disability insurance, survivor's insurance, old age insurance, and unemployment insurance was part of the Social Security Act of 1935. We don't think of it as Social Security because we've narrowed the definition, but it was among the founders considered Social Security. They thought about in the 1930s, 1934 and before, they talked about not just long-term permanent disability, they thought about temporary disability. We should add that. That would encompass parental leave. That is a kind of a time when you lose wages, take time out of the workforce. The same thing is true of sick pay, caring for a member of your family. All of these now, there are about a dozen bills that have been introduced in Congress that expand Social Security and increase its revenue so it is fully funded for the next 75 years and beyond. In fact, I think it's all the senators but 2 voted for it. This was an interesting one. It was Elizabeth Warren and Joe Manchin co-sponsored a resolution, so you had both wings to expand Social Security. All the Democrats, except 2, voted for it. None of the Republicans voted for it. There's legislation that's been introduced in Congress that has 163 co-sponsors. So the legislation is there, as I say. This is a question of values. We've got to raise our voices, and because the American people are united, as polarized as the American people are about many, many issues, they are not polarized about Social Security. They're not polarized about expanding Medicare. The American people want this, and we can afford it, and we should we should fight for it. And this is really where, again, these organizations that are sponsoring the symposium and other organizations are so important, because it is a question of education and a question of values. And together, we can make progress on Frances Perkins' resolution, her vision and legacy, and she can be shining down, and in 10 years from now, we can all come back together and talk about, isn't it great there's now child care credit and Social Security? Isn't it great there's now parental leave as part of Social Security, sick pay, and that the benefits, we have a retirement income crisis, the benefits have been doubled. Wouldn't that be nice? Thank you.
Well, thank you. It is, I have to say, such an honor to sit up here. I have a great sense of sort of legacy, being here in the Roosevelt House, sitting up here with Tricia and Nancy and Debbie, and thinking about sort of my generation and what we have to be fighting for, really building on what a lot of you have been fighting for many decades. So thank you, first of all, just for the work that you've done and continue to do. I think we have a lot of work ahead. So I'll say, from my perspective, I come into this work after spending about 6 years in frontline work, working with individuals who are low income, mostly women of color, trying to find employment that paid a living wage and a job that was safe and protected them. And I decided to go into public policy because I saw a lot of what we're talking about here, which is even if you work really hard, your ability to get a good job and advance in that job has really shifted in this economy. So I work currently at the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development. We issued a report called the Career Pathways Report, so I encourage you to go online and check it out. One of the things that is really the reason we exist and the reason we're in these conversations is that we're talking a lot about what has shifted economically. We've seen drastic shifts in the social contract between the relationship between an employer and an employee. A lot of my work is looking at education and training. And you think back into the days of Perkins and Roosevelt and what they were fighting for, employers really provided those things for their workers. And if you think about that, a lot of that is built because of the labor movement. Those are things that were negotiated through collective bargaining agreements where they said, okay, you're going to pay us a few more cents on the dollar, and we're going to provide really good training and opportunities for advancement for people in this workplace. And that is something we increasingly see doesn't happen. We increasingly rely on the public sector and on government and on nonprofits to provide those services. And this is something that we've really been asking is what has shifted? What does this mean? This is National Apprenticeship Week this week. And I think a lot about apprenticeship is this thing we've really been touting, even in this administration to some degree, maybe at a risk, as a thing that is a pathway to the middle class. And really, apprenticeship as a model exists because of labor and because of people like Perkins and Roosevelt who allowed for labor rights and worker voice and the ability to fight for that pathway into the middle class. And the labor movement built the middle class of this country, which we have really seen kind of eroding. So I want to kind of talk about some of the perils we see for my generation and also opportunities, things we've gotten to do in New York City, and maybe end with a, what do we do next question. I think the main thing we think about a lot here is that these protections we're talking about today that we're hearing about shouldn't be generational, right? It shouldn't be something where worker safety only existed for a few decades, or the right to a living wage, or the ability to retire, or just have basic economic security. These aren't things that should be expiring policies. These are things we should continue to be fighting for. So one of the major perils, I know Mary and I have talked about quite a lot, that we see for our generation for the shifts in the economy is this increase in the gig economy, right? So this is more and more workers, particularly in my generation, are working as 1099 employees. They're working in ways where they're not necessarily employed directly by the employer. And the employer then says, well, I don't necessarily have the rights to provide you things like sick time or healthcare coverage. So some of the basic benefits that they kind of, in this way, almost get out of having to provide. And I think there's, these kind of two ends that we're pulling on here, where people think technology is great, we're doing great things, and we're advancing in efficiency, but we're not necessarily asking the question about what is technology doing for workers. And I think that is something that we hear sort of in our generation comes through things like the fight for universal health care. This is a conversation that I hear a lot from my peers. And honestly, it's a response to the fact that it's not being provided by our employers anymore, right? More and more people are working. I knew many people, even with graduate degrees, working without health insurance. What does that mean, right? This sort of conversation we're hearing now about universal basic income, it's increasing. I go to a lot of these forums where people love to talk about the future of work, right? Automation, technology, what's happening next. I don't hear people talking about the future of workers. And I think that's something that's really important in this. We can't continue to talk about automation if we aren't talking about what happens to people. And this really gets back to something I think the ambassador touched on, which is, you know, we're very concerned right now about these new technology companies, and I will include people of my age group who are kind of the new class of billionaires, right? Who are really fighting for that maximum profit for the shareholders. And there is this sort of shift that needs to happen where we stop thinking about the shareholders as only the people who are invested in our company, also thinking about our workers as people who are invested in our company. There's been a lot of sort of interesting work and innovation thinking about worker co-ops. I'm sure some of you in this room have heard a little bit about, we have some great worker co-ops in New York City. Cooperative Home Care Associates, which is in the Bronx, which is actually one of the largest cooperatives of its kind, where the workers are actually invested as shareholders. They're provided extremely good training, benefits, protections. And so again, this is an economic shift that's happening because we see this erosion of protection for workers. And the workers are really coming together and saying, we want ownership. We want to be considered a shareholder. We want to be the person that you're fighting on behalf of. So those are some of the things I think I'm hearing that are maybe opportunities, but they're also concerns, right? And I think as we start to look forward, you know, I have to agree with Tricia. I see a lot of what's happening in states and in cities. And it is extremely important right now because it is a dangerous time. It's a dangerous time when low-income workers are still fighting for just the ability to put food on the table. It's a dangerous time when we stop considering the rights of workers as important as the rights of the people who are buying into companies. So to maybe end on a little happier note, we have seen some great progress in New York City, and I just want to tout a couple of things that we've been really fighting for. I have the privilege of serving in the de Blasio administration, and we've really seen a lot of folks who have raised their voices, and this comes from advocacy and actions and groups like the Women's City Club coming together and saying, this is necessary and we need this. We fought for paid sick leave, which was something that was passed in this administration. Of course, on the state level, the increase in minimum wage. Very recently, they passed the Fair Schedule Act, which was actually something I had the privilege of being a part of a task force at the Women's City Club talking about, hey, it's not just enough to pay a living wage if you're only making 9-10 hours a week. We need to fight for fair schedules. We need to fight for a worker's right to know their schedule a certain amount in advance. And I think there's, you know, some interesting things that'll be coming down the line. I want to end thinking about something we've been talking about a lot in my work, which is what is the future of these sort of workers' movements and workers' voice. You know, we talk about safety regulations, and I had the honor of being a part of a really interesting conversation that happened in New York City. So we recently passed legislation called 1447. It was a bill that basically instates a minimum amount of safety training required for all workers on construction sites in New York. But the path to that point was a really interesting journey for us. You know, I think we've entered this interesting place in the past maybe 5 or 6 years where we've created a false dichotomy between the sort of labor union trades and immigrant workers. And we hear this, right? We hear it on the campaign trail, the like, those people over there, they're taking our jobs kind of rhetoric. And in many ways, I think in New York City, we consider that a false dichotomy, right? This is not necessarily an us versus them. So in New York, what was really phenomenal about the negotiation around this legislation is that we saw the building and construction trades sitting together with the people who were organizing undocumented workers. And one of the things we noticed was when you look at construction deaths in New York City, so people who are violating OSHA, for the most part, the most exploited people in this economy are the people who are undocumented, right? They're the cheaper labor. They're the people who they're able to say, you know, I'll hold it against you if you don't do this thing, right? So we looked at the almost 30-something deaths that had happened over the past 3 years, and we saw almost all of them were people who were immigrant workers. And so the construction trades actually came and said, the history of the union and labor movement is that we fought for all workers, not just our members. And them sitting together and organizing and writing this bill, to me, that's the next step. That's where we need to go. It's not about us versus them, they're taking our jobs. It's about exactly what Tricia said, the big corporations versus the workers. And really at the end, it is the same fight. The undocumented workers who are fighting to organize, who are fighting to educate each other about their rights in the workplace, are fighting against the same exploitive practices that the union trades have been fighting against. And I think that is something I would challenge us to think about is how do we take that, what's happened in New York, to a level that's happening nationally, where we stop creating these false divisions and start thinking about the future of labor that is every single worker. And I think, you know, Perkins and Rose Perkins would have really been excited about that, considering her advocacy around immigrant workers and refugees, right? And this is really us coming together to say, you know, this thing that we're hearing, this language we're hearing from this administration, right? It has detrimental effects to exactly those people. And I think that's, you know, my challenge to you guys to think about what the Women's City Club can do and what we can do, and honestly what my generation has to bear as we kind of go into this new terrain of what this economy is going to look like in the future.
I'd like to plug a book by a former colleague of mine, David Weil, who was the wage hour administrator in the Obama administration. He's now the dean of the public policy school at Brandeis. And he wrote a book called The Fissured Economy, and I think that's very relevant. The fissured economy. And basically, he examined the way the economy is going, which is that firms who used to, well, I'm going to give an example of, I used to give McDonald's, but now I'll give hotels. You go into a Holiday Inn, and you would think that, you know, everybody there worked for Holiday Inn. But actually, they might work for Holiday Inn, the corporation. They might work for a franchisee of Holiday Inn. They might work for a management company that's contracted to a franchisee of Holiday Inn. And when you go to Holiday Inn, it's very possible that the people who check you in and the people who clean your rooms and the people who work in the restaurant are employed by 3 different employers. And that is the concept of the fissured workplace, which is that firms sort of take a lot of their employment responsibilities and they subcontract it out or they franchise it out. And what he found is in those situations, you're much more likely to find low wages and you're much more likely to find what people call wage theft, right? That people aren't getting even the wages that they're entitled to. Joint employment is a concept that, and it's been around forever. I mean, it's not a new concept, whatever, but the economy is changing that it becomes more important. That you could have more than one employer, or more than one employer would be responsible for your working conditions. And sometimes it's horizontal, so that Holiday Inn, when they have their franchisee, they tell that franchisee a lot of what their workers have to do. So they, in part, set the working conditions. Sometimes it's what I call vertical. I once had a case here in New York where you had a a care center for disabled kids. There was the daycare center, and then there was the night care center, right? So that, and many of the people many of the children in daycare went to the night care. But they had the same employees going back and forth, but they said, oh no, we're two different employers. Therefore, even though you're working 80 hours a week, you're not entitled to overtime because you're working only 40 hours for this employer and 40 hours for that employer. So that's the concept of joint employment. Different statutes have different tests, and the Browning-Ferris case is a case out of the National Labor Relations Board, which would have to do with joint employment under the National Labor Relations Act and whether or not you can have two people collective bargaining. It's, in my opinion, not a radical decision at all. It actually, like many, many things in labor law, it's back to the future. You know, that used to be the standard, and then in some other administration, we won't say whether it was R or D, pulled it back, and then we have an administration that sort of goes back to the future. There is a bill in Congress that passed the House last week that would not only take back that decision in the context of labor relations, of collective bargaining, but would take back what has been the standard under the Fair Labor Standards Act for the last 80 years, and make it very, very narrow. So as we see the proliferation of, we can call the gig economy, to me, is the fissured economy with a computer. But we have a lot of the fissured economy without a computer. And it would make it much more difficult to hold what I believe to be a responsible employer responsible for bad working conditions.
I was going to say, I think, we talk a lot about gig workforce, but I actually think Trisha's making a really important point. It's not just Uber and Lyft and Handy. I don't know if anyone knows these apps. Now there's like a dog walking app, but it's also it's almost every industry at this point where we contract out some of the lower level work. So we were doing some analysis in finance and looking at career pathways into finance, which is one of the biggest sectors in New York City. And a lot of those accounting jobs, which used to be really good, you could go get an accounting certificate. It's a good middle wage pathway into the middle class kind of job. They're now almost all 1099. They outsource to certain companies. And again, this is kind of like you have a company that has a selection of accountants, and they'll say, okay, you can have this person for, 2 months for a project. So again, that I think is part of this understanding that it's not just gig work like an individual employee, but it's also contracting out everything from like security to I think the Holiday Inn is a really good example, but it's almost every single industry. And if you start to kind of look when you walk around this city, you'll see, maybe I have a different badge on when you walk into the building, that person who's the doorman or the person who scans you in. And there's a lot of this where you're kind of employed by someone else so that you don't have to be protected under the same standards that are applying. So that I think is important. Yeah.
Well, this is a question to the audience, and this is a question that's related, but it's not direct. So I want our brilliant panel to figure out how to handle it, because it is asking a tough question. With the 24-hour, 7-day week, handheld devices, what should be done, and this is the key part, what should be done to regulate the workday? Where does one begin to cut into the Fair Labor Standards Act and the basic old coverage for the traditional workplace vis-a-vis the new workplace?
That is a tough question, but I think we have to go back to basics, okay? And the basics is this. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, you're entitled to be paid for the time you work. So if you are checking your BlackBerry late at night, you should be paid for that. And employers need to have policies that regulate that. So if your employer expects you to check your BlackBerry late at night, he should have a system that accounts for that, and you pay for that. Traditionally, there were two ways to regulate the workday. One of them was the concept that if you work, you get paid. And the second one was the concept of overtime. And one of the original reasons for overtime protections was not just to increase your wages, but it was actually because your wages were increased, it was to keep the workday down. It was an incentive for employers not to basically have you work 24/7 because he or she would have to pay a lot more. But we know that, we do live in, an economy where there is a lot of BlackBerry checking, where people are expected to be on call 24/7. The Labor Department in the last administration started to look at that issue, but they didn't get very far, frankly, at it because it is a complicated issue. And what you see is, again, I'm talking about peril, what you see as employers are expecting their workers to, work at odd hours or all the time, they're starting to pull back. So the employers are pulling back on the concept. So we had a number of cases at the Labor Department where you had a call center. And so the worker is there, they're at their computer, and if the worker wasn't getting a call at that minute, maybe they had to work 3 minutes, the employer said, you weren't working, we're not paying you for it. So they were saying, well, you're not working, and if the worker got up to go to the bathroom, you're not working, we're not paying you for it. So you're seeing some, at least in some industries, employers reacting to that by pulling back on.
I think an interesting point that I just want to put in, and it came out of some work at the Women's City Club, is there's this thing called big data. And big data has the ability to keep track of an awful lot of variables and an awful lot of aspects of a person's life or a group of employees' life. And it has been used badly to a certain extent. We saw this in predictable work schedules, et cetera. Being able to predict the weather 3 weeks from now at H&M or Zara or even Macy's, and being able to say how many workers you need and slimming down, et cetera. It can also be used in a very progressive way. There is no reason in the world that big data couldn't count mothers and children in the Bronx and Staten Island and the rest of it and give a pretty clear prediction about which employees they have, who could work where, under what circumstances. So I'm approaching now, having learned a few things, the whole question of big data a little differently. We got some really good questions on Social Security, and I fudged and handed them to our expert, and I'm going to let her sort of make all three of them run together and see if you can't address those questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. So there are two that really fit well together. And then a third, as you say, that's a part of the same question. The questions are, how do we get the general public to know that Social Security has the money to survive and should not be privatized or cut, or the number of people covered? And the other question is, how can we convince young people, that is millennials, that Social Security will be there for them even if they work in the gig economy? Now, there's a reason that so many Americans do not believe Social Security will be there for them. It's because there has been a 30-year campaign, literally billionaire funded, to undermine confidence in Social Security. They understood that as I said, there was this shift. Opponents on the other side, President Eisenhower, they've always been with us. President Eisenhower called them a small splinter group. Their number is negligible and they are stupid, is what he said in a private letter to his brother, which is also, now has become public. But that small splinter group realized they couldn't win on ideological grounds, so what they had to do was undermine confidence. Right after the Social Security amendments of 1983, the so-called Greenspan Commission that restored Social Security to long-range balance, there was a symposium held that fall in Washington that had a series of articles about, oh my God, what do we do now to undermine Social Security, published in Cato Journal, and this is another one that's online. It's called Achieving a Leninist Strategy. They thought they were being clever, and they talked about, we've got to be like Leninists, we have to undermine from within, we have to tell old people that their benefits are safe. We have to convince young people that they could do better saving on their own, and the program's not going to be with them, there for them. We got to tell the financial community that it's not there, and that's what's been going on. All of this information is online. Social Security is extremely conservatively financed. It's balanced. It cannot run a deficit. It is, and every year the trustees project out 75 years, which is most other countries project out their Social Security programs. I think Germany projects out 15 years, the OECD 45 years. So 75 years is a long time. It's supposed to restore confidence and build confidence. It does the opposite. So I think the interesting thing also about polling is the younger you are, the less likely you are to think Social Security will be there in the future. But if you ask a follow-up question, well, do you think then we should cut it? They go, no, we don't want, So what we've got to do is widespread education. The American people, as I say, want to believe what is really the truth. So it's really a question of all getting out there. The facts are clear, but it is a question, and I think it would help that have the Democrats running on strongly on and loudly on expanding Social Security, because as soon as you start talking about expanding it, the obvious question in your mind is, wait, I thought it was going bankrupt. So and there are, that I think is the way to do it, is to convince progressives to embrace this issue and run and win elections, so we have progressives in Washington who will then do the right thing and expand it.
This question is for Debbie Berkowitz, which is the person who wrote it said that they had read articles recently about more women being murdered in the service economy. And can you say something about fatalities versus injuries and gender?
Yes. So, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that workplace violence is very real in a lot of industries, and the good news is some states are moving forward to do things about this. So the Service Employees International Union ran a terrific campaign in California about rape on the night shift. It was a Frontline, I believe, documentary about women janitors who cleaned buildings after work and were repeatedly sexually assaulted and raped. And a lot of them were immigrant workers. I mean, they were citizens too, but culturally, it turns out that sometimes it was somebody they knew, or they raped them, or their supervisor, and they didn't want to get fired. And so it's a significant enough issue in the workplace violence, and it's especially a lot of it ends up affecting women. In Massachusetts, a young woman was killed who was in one of the halfway houses for emotionally disabled people, and she got murdered because there was sort of no protection and there was no system for her to set an alarm, and she was there all alone. So workplace violence in a lot of the service sector is there, and it's real, and it's especially prevalent in healthcare, where patients often attack, especially in hospitals that deal with the emotional issues and sort of mental disabilities. And it's a big enough issue that OSHA decided they needed to take a look at it. And they needed to think about actually putting out information to employers of how to prevent this and maybe writing a regulation. But of course, that was taken right off OSHA's agenda. It was one of the first things the Trump administration did. They're no longer focused on it. So I believe a lot of the protections will have to come in different states following what California did. So that's the progress as opposed to the peril.
Thank you. The question here, which I will just throw out to everyone, but Patricia might jump on it, I hope. As we read about the appointment of so many right-wing judges, what legal strategies do we need to move our issues forward?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, don't go to the Supreme Court. That's yes, the Supreme Court, especially with the new justice on progressive issues, is likely to be not a good court. So especially on labor issues, I am always loath to have a case go to the Supreme Court. Because this is a 501c3, I'm going to try to respect that and basically say the strategy is elections have consequences. I am constantly shocked by the stories you read in the paper about judges who the American Bar Association rates as not qualified, who, because they only need 50 votes to get confirmed, are being confirmed. I was at the American Bar Association Labor and Employment meeting last weekend, and I ran into a woman who is a law professor in Tennessee, and she was on the ABA committee that rated the last individual not qualified. He was like 11 years out of law school. He'd never tried a case. He'd never been in the courtroom. He got a lifetime appointment as a judge. They ruled him not qualified, and she said that the attacks coming onto the committee for ruling him not qualified were just awful. And she said, I am a tenured law professor, so I can stand up to these personal attacks. But other people on the committee are lawyers in private practice. They need clients, right? And there is a public campaign against the members of the American Bar Association who have rated these folks as not qualified. Is there a legal strategy to deal with that? No, there is not a legal strategy. There has to be an election strategy. I'm going to tell you one more story about this. The Labor Department regulations, many of which I've talked about, which are being taken back, were most of them challenged in court when they came out, which is what we expected. And they were often challenged in multiple locations. And if we got challenged in Minnesota, we won. If we got challenged in the DC Circuit, we won. If we got challenged in Texas, we lost. And that became the venue of choice for people challenging Labor Department regulations. And in every case that was brought against the Labor Department in Texas, we lost. Even when the same challenge was brought in other courts in other states and we were winning. So again, I think it's a real and pressing issue that this administration is appointing judges at a rapid pace. Those judges have lifetime appointments. And to go back to the Supreme Court, we basically have status quo. I mean, Justice Scalia died, and the justice that was appointed is probably Scalia-ish, so that the court's not any different. But the next vacancy on the Supreme Court is likely to be one of the more progressive judges. And therefore, if this administration gets an opportunity to appoint that judge, then the composition of the court will shift radically.
And if I can just add to that, because I agree with everything you've said, that a lot of these rulings have widespread consequences. There's a case in front of the Supreme Court this term. That would really decimate the union movement. It would undermine AFSCME, public employees. And it looks like they will rule against labor. And all I can say, and this is what this panel is really all about, none of these programs will be here without the union movement. So part of the strategy is electoral. The other part is, I think, rehabilitating unions and making American workers understand how vital unions are. I think about all these football players and baseball players are all unionized, and I'd love to see public service announcements with saying, I'm bigger and richer and stronger than any of you, but I need a union. I don't know why you people don't. I mean, we need to do something to both strengthen unions and protect ourselves electorally from this flooding of the courts.
And frankly, The news is even worse than that, because the case in front of the Supreme Court has to do with what we call fair share dues, which is that if you are part of the collective bargaining union and you're getting the benefits of the contract, you have to pay dues, not political dues, which are separate and voluntary, but dues that fund the administration of the contract. That's likely to go out the door in this case. There was another case that the court did not take yesterday, which is the next case, which I'm sure they will. And the argument is exclusive representation is a violation of the First Amendment, that you should not have to be in the collective bargaining unit, which will be the end of public sector unions, because there's no way that the government is going to bargain with the union and then bargain with individuals also who don't want to associate with the union. And the next argument is that private sector unions, the same thing argument's going to be made, because the National Labor Relations Act, which requires fair share dues in the private sector, which requires exclusive representation, it's a law. It's going to be the government imposing it upon the private sector, and they're going to be arguing it's a violation of the First Amendment. So there is a strategy, a legal strategy that the anti-union groups have.
Which brings me to a question. When I was reading our book today, I found this incredible sentence, which I wish I had written out, that Frances Perkins said to Franklin Roosevelt, "You know, Mr. President, this isn't going to be easy, because there should be no federal legislation. It is unconstitutional to have federal legislation covering worker rights." And they had to work around that. They were born into a time. That was a huge impediment for Frances Perkins. I'm not a lawyer, and she didn't go into it, but he said, "We will figure it out, Frances." Do you happen to know how they figured it out?
I do. Well, no, go ahead. You go ahead. You don't remember the Roosevelt court packing?
But it was,
Elections have consequences.
yeah, exactly. I mean, the Supreme Court, all of this legislation was in peril, and in fact, it was all, there were cases brought before the Supreme Court, and people thought Social Security, Fair Labor Standards, they thought they were all going to be thrown out, because the history, there have been very few federal laws ruled unconstitutional in the whole history of the country. There were more in the first 18 months of the Roosevelt administration, and then in the whole history, it was all kinds of things were being held unconstitutional. And that's when President Roosevelt tried to pack the courts to get a majority rule. There was real pushback on that. And oddly, in the Supreme Court, the Social Security decision actually was one of the turning points, along with the Fair Labor Standards Act. One justice changed, and they called it the change in time that saved the nine, was the slogan that was used. And people thought it was because of the election or because of the court packing, but his records show he was going to change that anyway. So nobody really knows what caused it, but it was the elections have consequences. There was all this pressure, the court packing, and they simply shifted, and then a more progressive court came out, and good law was established at that time. But the courts are crucial, and elections matter.
One really interesting story about that is, and this is in many biographies of Frances Perkins, is supposedly she was at a cocktail party, and I think it was Justice Brandeis, anyway, one of the justices of the Supreme Court, it was Stone, basically whispered to her, "Think taxes, Frances, think taxes," right? Because the contract theory had been often ruled unconstitutional, so the linchpin of Social Security and unemployment insurance is tied to the taxing power. And supposedly she took that into consideration as she was developing the program. So think taxes.
I don't think it would be fair. You all have been very good about your writing these very good questions. So we do have time, if there's somebody that doesn't like to write, who has a burning question and you'd like to ask it, I am going to use my prerogative to open it to the floor for a few seconds.
Nephew was married to, I've forgotten exactly.
Actually, I could use some clarification on that. This is so complicated. The formula for state and federal and Brandeis law was so important. You know, that I think it was designed for unemployment that had to be administered by the state.
Well, and actually, it was very bold. What the Committee on Economic Security realized was that, especially with Social Security, it had to be a federal program because people changed jobs, they moved states, and they wouldn't get their benefits for 40 years. But even state, federal was, the federal government, of course, has limited power. So it did not look like there was any way you could get a federal, purely federal program through. The state one was the one with the taxing power. They thought, well, could it be interstate commerce? Could it be taxes? And it was Stone who whispered it, the taxing power is all you need, my dear, was the line. Exactly, although that's a very long and complicated. Exactly.
I think
But-
one of the wonderful things about today that surprised me is how we have stuck with history. And I think we need history when we are in new times with uncharted territory and the unions are not as strong and it is simply not then. And let's hope to God there's not a war around the corner to, quote, fatten the worker through service. But I'm going to close and turn this over to my good colleague and friend that I've enjoyed so much helping shape this program with, Elizabeth Lubetkin. But I want to remind you all of that wonderful story. The Depression is on, and I think it was Harry Hopkins had the idea. We just have to take these guys in the inner city, and they were guys in those days, and we're gonna go out there and fix up all the parks. We're going to fix up all the parks, everything rural. It'll be good for them. There'll be fresh air. We'll get them out of that, awful city, et cetera, and they're going to town on this subject. This is all in that Kirsten Downey's book. It's quite wonderful. They're going to town in the cabinet meeting, and Frances Perkins is sitting there. And finally, after they've realized this is the way to put people back to work, this is the Great Jobs Program, she says, Mr. President, when you get all these inner city men out into the country, what are you going to do with them? And he turns to her and he says, Frances, that's your problem. And this woman, in an amazing way, like these amazing women here, did make it her problem. She knew there were tents and jugs of water and cots and all those things and some unemployed World War I colonels and captains, and she went to work. So I think we all have to go to work. I know I feel personally inspired at the Women's City Club. I hope all our colleagues do. There's a lot of work to be done. It's no joke. And on that note, I'm going to turn this over to Ms. Lipton.
Before I thank everybody, and there are a lot of people to be thanked, I just want to say that today we have reflected on many of the current status of the programs that both Eleanor and Frances advocated for and implemented. I mean, I remember reading one of the books about Eleanor in terms of her concern about labor, and she went out to California at one point when there was a strike, and she was involved, and I believe her husband told her not to, and she would not listen to him. These programs have positively impacted millions and millions of Americans since they were first enacted in FDR's administration, and we must do all we can today to preserve them. We at the Women's City Club will be taking what we have learned today to work on what actions we can and should take to preserve this legacy. And I think what we learned today is sort of an action program for us. So let me then, is Harold Holzer around? Probably not. You are here. Oh, Harold, thank you. I want to thank you particularly for all the help and support you gave in putting this together and for getting that remarkable gentleman, the ambassador. I mean, this was an extraordinary speech by him. He just read off. I know he had little notes. He was writing them from the beginning, but he just read it off beautifully. We'll have him more often. And also just allowing us to be here at Roosevelt House. It is a treat. I also want to thank Michael Cheney from the Francis Perkins Center in Newcastle, Damascotta. I say both because your offices are in Damascotta, even though the house is in Newcastle. I happen to know about this because I summer near there. And I want to thank our panelists for all of your insights on all of these issues. Each of you has presented us with some thoughts, some ideas of where we can go from here, and just we can cogitate on so much of what you said. And I guess that's it. I just want to thank everybody for today's work. Pardon me? Yes, there is also, I meant to say it earlier, but where is Padma and the rest of the staff from the WCC for all the work they did? Padma, would you stand up so everybody knows who you are? There have been days when Padma sits there and I'm calling her and I said, let's do this, and she responds. Anyway, thank you all for coming, and I don't know what else to add. Does anybody else want to add something? Okay, thank you.